Appamada's programs and facilities are supported through your generosity. Your support really does make a huge difference. You'll find a link for contributions on the website at appamada.org/contribute. Thank you so much.
I feel very lucky to be able to present this. This is something I've been thinking about one way or another for years, and I want to say that. Where are my notes? Excuse me. It was kind of a surprise this morning. Anne read a quote from the quotes calendar that we have, and it was a quote from Albert Einstein that had been suggested years ago by Peg, and has been part of the calendar for at least 2 years now, since I started compiling it. And it goes like this: a human being is part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. We experience ourselves, our thoughts and feelings, as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. And this is what makes this quote famous, is that play on words, not optical illusion, but delusion of consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from the prison, or from this prison, by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living beings and the whole of nature in its beauty. The true value of a human being is determined by the measure and the sense in which they have obtained liberation from the self. We shall require a substantially new manner of thinking if humanity is to survive. I've heard and read that quotation many times, and it is joined with other similar sayings from the Buddha and from teachers up to the present day that shape my thinking. So it's not surprising, really, that I wanted to talk about something that's very close to the topic. Nevertheless, a delightful coincidence, and it was just today that Anne read that quote at the beginning of the sitting. I want to talk about why it's necessary for our own liberation and for humanity's sake to stop thinking about ourselves exclusively, so that we can open to connection with others. And by connection, I mean what Einstein was saying about compassion, and I would add gratitude in there as well. As beings, we have what we call consciousness, although it's very difficult to define what consciousness consists of. The philosopher and physicist Christoph Koch says that consciousness is really any subjective experience, and that what amounts to consciousness is the feeling of what it's like to be oneself, starting with an experience of external phenomenon, and that it's something we share with all living beings. In my own experience of what I would naively call my consciousness, that sense of consciousness is most of the time covered up by heaps of emotion, conditioning, and unconscious storytelling. Given the amount of anger, heedlessness, and aggression in our world, it seems like there's lots of unconscious consciousness everywhere. The Buddha taught for decades, and one of his central teachings from start to finish was that subjectivity itself, this notion that we are subjects and everything else is an object that we are separate from, is based on delusion, the optical delusion that Einstein is referring to. He taught that we are not ever separate selves, that really all we exist is as a stream of apprehensions and reactions to ongoing experience. And he said there are very simple experiments we can perform, not just to know this intellectually, but to embody it, so that embodiment will turn our knowledge of this surprising and yet intimately true fact will turn it into compassionate action. So not long ago, I ran across a sutra that I had never seen before, which focuses on this kind of teaching. It's called the Bahiya Sutra. I want to share it with you, and then I want to suggest some thought experiments that we can try and that I hope we can discuss afterwards. As explained in the sutra, Bahiya was not a follower of the Buddha, but he was apparently someone who had gone into homelessness, searching for liberation on his own, and he had become celebrated as a teacher. People gave him gifts. They revered him as a teacher. He apparently, as you'll hear mentioned, dressed in clothing made from tree bark, because in the sutra he's called Bahiya of the bark cloth. In the sutra, it says that in private he had doubts. Here's a quotation from the translation that's on the website Access to Insight. Then, when he was alone in seclusion, this line of thinking appeared in Bahiya's awareness. Now, of those who in this world are arahants or have entered the path of arahantship, am I one? He doesn't know if he has a correct understanding and if he has gone beyond his desires enough to make a difference for his enlightenment. A devata, a kind of god who may be male or female, I don't know, appears to him and says, you ought to go talk to the Buddha about that. At the time, Bahiya was living near the seashore, and he made a journey, which must have been quite arduous, into the mountains south of Nepal to where the Buddha was, near Savatthi. And he finally gets there and he meets the Buddha and he says, please give me your teaching. I want to know what is the core of your teaching. And the Buddha puts him off twice. He says, excuse me, I'm out asking for alms. I'm asking for food for myself and my followers, and really we need to focus on this right now. Come back later. And he does it twice. And so the sutra continues. A third time, Bahiya said to the Blessed One, but it is hard to know for sure what dangers there may be for the Blessed One's life, or what dangers there may be for mine. Teach me the Dharma, O Blessed One. Teach me the Dharma, O well-gone one. That will be for my long-term welfare and bliss. And the Buddha says, okay, Bahiya, you should train yourself thus. In reference to the seen, there will be only the seen. In reference to the heard, only the heard. In reference to the sensed, only the sensed. In reference to the cognized, only the cognized. That is how you should train yourself. When, for you, there will be only the seen in reference to the seen, only the heard in reference to the heard, only the sensed in reference to the sensed, only the cognized in reference to the cognized. Then, Bahiya, there is no you in connection with that. When there is no you in connection with that, there is no you there. There is no you there, and there is no you here. You are neither here, nor yonder, nor between the two. This, just this, is the end of stress, which I take as stress being a kind of unusual translation of dukkha in this sense, or in this context. Through hearing this brief explanation of the Dhamma from the Blessed One, the mind of Bahiya, of the bark cloth, right then and there, was released from effluence through lack of clinging substance. He then having exhorted Bahiya of the bark cloth with this brief explanation of the Dhamma, the Blessed One left. Now, not long after the Blessed One's departure, Bahiya was attacked and killed by a cow with a young calf. Then the Blessed One, having gone out for alms in Savatthi after the meal, returning from his alms round with a large number of monks, saw that Bahiya had died. On seeing him, he said to the monks, "Take Bahiya's body, monks, and placing it on a litter, and carrying it away, cremate it, and build him a memorial. Your companion in the holy life has died. So this is a very condensed and pithy version of teachings that the Buddha gave many times. In another early sutra, he had led his followers through the process of paying attention to what was going on in their sense, in the relationship between their minds and their sense organs, and saying, can you find yourself in your hearing? If there was a real self, you would be able to isolate it, and you would be able to know that you could direct what your hearing is doing. But pay attention to your hearing. Can you direct what you hear? Or is it something like a process that's happening on its own? This has just been huge for me, and I come back to this daily, as a matter of fact, as I think about my own life. So I want to, as I say, talk about some experiments that have to do with hearing and seeing and other senses that we have in just using pretty much the language that the Buddha used in earlier sutras and in this one. I want to say, first of all, that in doing so, I will have to be using language where I say you and I and your thoughts and your feelings and so on, in which I'm smuggling back in the sense of a separate self, just because that's the way the English language is. I don't know if other languages can make a simpler break or a simpler way of description that doesn't carry that so much. But just be aware of that this is a linguistic convention, and it's not the truth. And before that, I want to read something from one of my favorite books. It's called Conscious. It's by a writer named Annika Harris, who's a consciousness researcher and writes about it in a non-academic way that I find very enjoyable. But she gives a wonderful example of hitting a tennis ball, being out on a tennis court and hitting a tennis ball, and what's going on in the body and mind over the period of time that we're engaged in the activity of hitting a tennis ball. She says, as we go about our daily lives, we experience what appears to be a continuous stream of present moment events. Yet we actually become conscious of physical events in the world slightly after they have occurred. And this is something that's immediately apparent, I think, if you spend any time in meditation, that by the time that there is a gap between looking at the wall and processing in your conscious mind that you're looking at a wall. She says, in fact, one of the most startling findings in neuroscience has been that consciousness, that is particularly the word forming parts of our minds, that part of the mind is often, quote, the last to know. Visual, auditory, and other kinds of sensory information move throughout the world and our nervous system at different rates. The light waves and sound waves emitted the moment the tennis ball makes contact with your racket, for example, do not arrive at your eyes and ears at the same time. And the impact felt by your hand holding the racket occurs at yet another interval. To complicate matters further, the signals perceived by your hands, eyes, and ears travel different distances through your nervous system to reach your brain. Your hands are a lot farther away from your brain than your ears are. Only after all the relevant input has been received by the brain do the signals get synchronized and enter your conscious experience through a process called binding, whereby you see, hear, and feel the ball hit the racket all in the same instant, which has not happened, but your brain is telling you a story that it's happening all at the same instant. As the neuroscientist David Eagleman puts it, your perception of reality is the end result of fancy editing tricks. The brain hides the difference in arrival times. How? What it serves up as reality is actually a delayed version. Your brain collects up all the information from the senses before it decides upon the story of what happens. The strange consequence of all this happening is that you live in the past. By the time you think the moment occurs, it's already gone. To synchronize the incoming information from the senses, the cost is that our conscious awareness lags behind the physical world. Not a lot, but nevertheless, measurably. She gives one more example. She says, surprisingly, our consciousness also doesn't appear to be involved in much of our own behavior, apart from bearing witness to it. A number of fascinating experiments have been conducted in this area, and the neuroscientist Michael, and I don't know how to pronounce his name, Gazzaniga, I don't know where the accent goes. Michael Gazzaniga describes some of them in detail in a wonderful chapter entitled The Brain Knows Before You Do in his book called The Mind's Past. Some of these experiments, most famously conducted by, I'll skip over this part. Some of these experiments show that your brain prepares a complex motor movement of your body, like, for example, putting your hands together and preparing to bow. A complex motor movement of your body. The body prepares these before you are aware of deciding to move. In such experiments, subjects watch a special clock, and according to an instrument similar to the second hand on a traditional clock, mark the exact moment when they decide to move a finger, for instance. But using EEG, researchers can reliably detect the cortical activity signaling these impending movements about half a second before subjects feel they have made the decision to move. So again, the mind, that what's happening in our consciousness is a construction of a story that takes some time, as much as a half a second. So with that in mind, let's just do some experiments. And let me ask, if you will, just close your eyes. Okay, no, keep your eyes open for the first one. I'm sorry, because it's about sight. And for myself, it helps me to think of sight as a field or as like a screen that is present to me, that's present in awareness. And to know, it has some sense that the awareness is not me, and what I'm taking as the things I'm looking at are in fact just a field in that awareness, rather than things out there that I am looking at. So just, if you can, through whatever means works for you, see if you can look without a sense of self, where you're neither here nor there nor any place. In the Buddha's instructions on this, he also, in other places, says, can you decide what to see and to not see? You can turn your head, you can close your eyes, but in the act of seeing as it's happening, you are seeing what's directly in front of you, and you're also actively not seeing things that are not directly in front of you. You know, that your optic nerves and your brain and all of your body are working together. And at some point in the apprehension of this, you're deciding what's real and not real. And your other senses are telling you things about what's real and not real. The temperature, the sound. Sound is huge. And the the place that your body's in and your interoperception about how your body is positioned relative to other things also play a huge role in being able to apprehend visual stimuli as real and worth making up stories about, worth saying, oh, I'm looking at the altar at Appamada right now. Same thing with hearing. This one's easier for me because of it made such an impact on me when I first read the Buddha's words about hearing. He says to his followers, can you decide what to hear? The answer is no. Only if you could decide to hear would there be a self within your hearing. Your hearing is just a process. It's going on by itself. So again, for just about a minute, let's sit together and pay attention to what's going on in the field of hearing and whether or not there's really any you in hearing except after the fact. Good. Okay. So for me, at least hearing and sight are within my capacity to experiment with. Cognizing, in the sense of thinking about external objects, recognizing what's in my sensory field, and then the thoughts that are just coming up out of my mind by themselves from what I think is called the default networks. That's so active when we just try and be quiet and still. Our mind, the parts of our brain get together and show us movies, make up stories about the past and the future. That's what this default network does, and it's called the default network because it's always there. It is in cognizing that I have the strongest sense of I am a separate self, and it's really unshakable for me. And I just wonder what I would love to do in just a minute is to ask some questions about whether other people have that same sort of sense, that same sort of differentiating sense about approaching and recognizing this self status relative to sensory things that are coming into the mind, and whether that's different from thinking thoughts about what's coming into the mind for you. Before I get to that, I want to say that the whole goal of the Buddha's teaching was liberation, and that for the Buddha, as he said many times, liberation was directly connected to to compassion, to sympathetic joy, to equanimity, to states of mind that support us in meeting the world in an open and receptive way, and getting out of what Einstein calls the prison of ourself. And these types of thought experiments do not intellectually bring up compassion and gratitude and equanimity and so on. Maybe some equanimity, maybe some patience with myself. maybe a little bit of self-compassion, but not for others, not so much, at least not intellectually. And yet, again, talking about brain structures, Rick Hansen says that the parts of the brain that are involved in paying attention to moment by moment experience without judgment, and that's an important thing which I left out. Oh yeah, there's no judgment in there. That those parts of the brain that are involved in paying attention to moment experience without judgment, but just letting them be what they are right next to the centers in the brain that have to do with compassion and gratitude. And that there's apparently some of the electrochemical activity kind of leaks over. And the more you sit, the more likely you are to be developing compassion for yourself, for others, gratitude for the excessive grandeur of every single blade of grass, So that's where I want to stop talking and ask for your feedback. Just what do you think about this? What does it matter that experience is delayed, that recognition of experience is delayed, and that we're always some fractions of a second behind what we actually experience? And what does that have to do with compassion? And is it possible to think to put yourself in a place of looking where it's not you looking, but just sight is happening? I'd love to have your feedback on those questions. I see Rosemarie. Welcome.
Thanks, Joel. So to answer the question you just asked, like why is it important? I think it's critical because as humans within that little space, we just fill it up. We fill it up with self. And for me personally, it's a preoccupation with my identities that, that's where it is. So I think that's really important. And once we're off and running, or once I am, like I've missed so much. Yeah. So I think it is really important. Something that I've been thinking about like why we might struggle with the connectedness that exists. And I was thinking that maybe, at least for me again, that receptivity to warmth and loving connections, that for me, I'm thinking that maybe that happens at the same, if I work with that the receptivity, that might be, this is self-talk here, pushing, helping the self-talk to release. So it might be happening at the same time. That's just my thought about that for me, that those two, I think are, there might be something there for me. So for each of us, like what's our personal hindrance for the not experiencing the connectedness? I think that's really key. Yeah. So thank you so much. Really great.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Good morning, Joel. Thank you for this. Absolutely fascinating. I'm glad it's being recorded. It's brought up so much for me to reflect on. The first thing that came to mind is an extraordinary passage in a book called North Woods, in which an artist is in the woods and he's trying to paint. First he discusses another artist, And he talks about how that artist is in his paintings, even if he doesn't paint himself into the paintings. That artist is always in his paintings. And he wants to know, how can he paint the woods so it's just the woods without himself in the painting? And I'm also really fascinated by the way we construct what we think is reality. And that was a really excellent description of certain processes involved in that. I remember reading about an article about how we see what we expect to see. So, for example, there was an example given that a wife tells her husband to go get the mustard from the cabinet, and he goes and he comes back and he says, "There's no mustard." And she said, "Yes, there is." And he goes back and he comes back and he says, "There's no mustard." It turns out the mustard was in a plastic bottle, not in a glass jar. So it didn't look like what he thought mustard was. So he literally didn't see it, even though it was right in front of him. I also think about this book called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, which is a way of, it teaches you how to engage the right brain, or at least parts of the right brain. And because the narrative, numerical, linear brain will look at a subject and say, okay, now I'm drawing the nose. And instead of drawing what's there, the left brain will draw what it thinks a nose should look like. And the left brain really isn't very good at that. Whereas if you switch into a visual part of your brain, sounds will disappear, the concept of time will disappear, and you will become, in a way, one with what you're seeing, in the sense that you're entirely present with every, it's just a line and then a curve and then a darker value, and then there's no sense that it's a draw or a jaw or an ear. That's not in the mind. The mind is just curve, dark, light. It could be anything. And then when you come out of it, you go, well, at least I go, who on earth drew that? Like, I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. It's because there's only a part of my brain that knows how to do that. And I do have a question. I have had a question for a while about what is involved in shifting into, for example, this visual part of the brain, which is able to be fully present. It happens in music also. If you are able to shift into that part of your brain, you are the music, time doesn't exist. And I feel like that's those states, which I used to enter frequently and felt very nurturing to me. It's like time off from the critical brain.
Mhm.
What role does shifting into those states play in being fully present, for example, and in mindfulness? And is anybody exploring that?
I think that's a wonderful question. I know it brings up, to me, it brings up what Dogen describes as zazen, that body and mind drop away. And you're describing modes of activity with a particular kind of focus, physical activity focus, that let body and mind drop away, it sounds like. I've had some experiences like that, and that somehow that there is a trick, by turning up, if you're trying to draw something, if you can turn it upside down, is
Yes.
the experiment that I'm familiar with, that frees your mind to get out of your preconceptions in that way.
Absolutely.
And that-
Yes.
yeah, and that this is a window on Dogen's thinking for me that you're providing, that Dogen is over and again giving us ways to kind of turn our expectations upside down, and our cliched expectations about how things are supposed to be, to step outside that. So are there people talking about that and doing that? Yeah, all over the place.
In relation to Buddhism?
Well, Dogen, and anybody that's paying attention to Dogen, I think, maybe so, and it shows up in many other places in Theravadan teaching and other types of Buddhist teaching. I know Shinzen Young has got exercises that are very much like what you're saying, and he's from Shingon Buddhism, which is active in Japan and was active in Japan for a couple hundred years before Soto Zen came along. But I love this kind of discussion, but to me, really, if there's not an ethical dimension to it, if it doesn't lead to requirements on ourselves to step outside preconceptions about how important we are, to at least have some kind of opening to other people, that is just an intellectual exercise. So I see Kim moving and maybe turning off the mute. So do you have a question, Kim?
I have a
Okay,
comment.
well, let me just, Genev, does that,
I wanted
have you
to say
said what
one
you
more
wanted to
thing.
say?
It just occurred to me, I've only really, excuse me, I've only really truly experienced a trance state a couple of times. And both of them involved very, very complex interlocking African drumming rhythms, which I truly believe do something to the brain. And in one case, I was playing Haitian voodoo drumming in a circle, and the complexity of the interlocking parts was so great that all I could figure out is how my part connected with the part next to me. If you asked me to tell you how all the parts fit together, I couldn't have done it. But once I became part of this interlocking rhythm, I was completely liberated. I was not me. I was beyond. And and it is the other time it happened was when I was practicing capoeira, which is a Brazilian martial art, and they do that to African traditional African rhythm, interlocking rhythms too. And in both cases, and that's also in a circle. And in both cases, it did feel like connectedness to all being and not being me. Like it felt beyond me. It felt like the beingness. That's what I was in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kim?
Yeah, so there was a photographer, Ernest Haas, I think it's Haas, and he spoke about the difference between looking and seeing. And he said looking is merely orienting yourself, but seeing is like way beyond that. And I noticed when we did the exercise that I would look and I kind of had this broad view of everything. But then I started noticing the leaves kind of dancing on our window screen or a bulge in the floor. And at that point, it seemed like I lost myself.
So you were, okay, interesting. So it was not just like, it was just not a global thing, but where you were being able to, in a way, notice more fully elements within the overall picture. Is that right?
Yeah, there was not one noticing even. There was just my full awareness was in the dance or in the bulge.
Mhm.
Anyway, that's it.
Thank you. So thank you for mentioning the word dance too, because Rosemarie, I want to ask you a question. As a dancer, have you had experiences like that? And more than just the experience, would you say that it opens you to more connection with other people, or has opened you to more connection with other people?
Much later in life, yes. As a younger dancer, just a lot of anxiety about doing it right, and there's a lot of pressure to be perfect and to be very thin and all of those things. But there was another thing that relates to what you're talking about in terms of dance, and that is that, you know, dancers have to go to class. So these exercises that we do, they're really, your body is doing them before your mind knows. So that was an aspect that really fit with what you were saying about the brain, just the body knowing way ahead of the brain.
What is often called muscle memory, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the connection part, because it's a discipline and it's, you know, the society that we're in, I would say that probably dance teaching has probably come a long way in that respect, to helping people to connect more with each other and be more of a fellowship. Is a very hard environment to, but I think it's probably getting better. Thanks for asking.
Thank you.
It's about time for us to wrap up our questions.
Very good. Thank you, Joan. Let me make one comment too that came up for me when we were talking before, and I forget exactly what it was, but it had to do with kind of sudden awakening and awareness, as opposed to this being a lifelong process. You know, that this dropping away of body and self, or body and mind, and dropping away the ever recurring sense of self that comes up moment by moment, faster than we can, before we have processed, oh, I wasn't hung up on myself for a moment there, it's already back. That's not something that we're going to get to the end of, but it is something that we can incorporate in our lives. That we you know, we have an intention to serve all beings, as impossible as that sound. I love what Peg said a couple weeks ago, that the vow of the Bodhisattva's vow to liberate all beings is not impossible, because, as she said, think of it the way that a doctor might think about saving all beings. That doctor doesn't think that she's going to save everybody who has every disease in the world, but the orientation is everybody that comes to her will get the best efforts that she can make, and that is the orientation of the Bodhisattva's vow. And I think that can also apply in this relatively abstruse notion of seeing through our perception to how self is popping up over and over again, and that we don't always have to believe it, that we can have a sense that be held lightly enough that we can move away from it, and it can drop away. Thank you.